There's really no best case scenario. There's just a series, unfortunately, of perhaps less bad scenarios. And what I mean by that is we are obviously living in this period, as you and I both know, we've talked about for many years, of just a crisis for our democracy. And the tip of the spear, the real danger, is that we have an aspiring autocrat in the form of Donald Trump who is running on a platform of revenge and retribution to be a dictator on day one and quote unquote terminate the Constitution if he needs to in parts. And I take him very seriously. I take him at his word on that. And so the worst case scenario is that he actually is returned to power and is in a position, because he learned his lessons from the first time, to be much more successful at being the autocrat than he was the first time, just as Viktor Orban was more successful the second time around. That's the worst case scenario.
We're weeks away from the election, and I know a lot of you are nervous, not only because of the result, but whether, and I'll be blunt, whether Republicans are going to cheat, whether they're going to try to suppress the vote, whether they're going to try to miscount the votes, whether they're going to try to throw out votes or reverse the results of votes. And it's a pretty scary prospect when you feel like the pro-democracy candidate not only has to win, but has to win by a big enough margin so the other side can't steal it. This was not the system that the founders gave us. So I thought it was a good time to go talk to one of our democracy experts who played, I think, an unsung role in 2020 in conjunction with other activists and other pro-democracy groups in guiding us through that election system and making sure the results were upheld. And he has been a constant voice for pro-democracy reforms, regardless of which party is in power and regardless of which party benefits from it. So our guest today is Ian Bassin. Ian was an ethics lawyer in the Obama administration, so he knows from what he speaks about executive branch issues. And after leaving office, he founded a group called Protect Democracy, and they file suits and engage in public education, do all sorts of good work, put out suggestions for reforms. And he was rewarded for his work by being designated with a genius grant by the MacArthur Foundation. So not every day we get to speak to a genius. So I'm delighted to have Ian talk to us this week, and welcome to the show, Ian.
Jan, it's great to be on with you.
What keeps you up late at night about this election?
I think actually what keeps me up at night is that there's really no best case scenario. There's just a series, unfortunately, of perhaps less bad scenarios. And what I mean by that is we are obviously living in this period, as you and I both know, we've talked about for many years, of just a crisis for our democracy. And the tip of the spear, the real danger, is that we have an aspiring autocrat in the form of Donald Trump who is running on a platform of revenge and retribution to be a dictator on day one and quote unquote terminate the Constitution if he needs to in parts. And I take him very seriously. I take him at his word on that. And so the worst case scenario is that he actually is returned to power and is in a position, because he learned his lessons from the first time, to be much more successful at being the autocrat than he was the first time, just as Viktor Orban was more successful the second time around. That's the worst case scenario. But frankly, the best case scenario isn't super attractive either. And that's a scenario in which Kamala Harris wins the election because she is the only of the two candidates committed to constitutional representative democracy, and a sizable portion of the country simply don't accept it. And I think we saw what that looked like in January of 2021 on January 6th. And I think we are in store for something that's going to be just as challenging, if not more so, even if the pro-democracy candidate wins. So what keeps me up at night is just the moment we're in for the country. We're just in a period of crisis for this country that we've got to somehow find a way through.
One thing that I'm keeping my eye on, and I suspect is going to be a major theme we'll hear if Donald Trump loses, is this myth of illegal immigrants voting. You hear this refrain now again and again and again. What are they aiming for? And is this a real thing? Or is this one of these myths that they are using to pre-butt the results of a losing election for them.
I don't know if you remember. Of course, you remember back in advance of the 2018 midterms. All of a sudden, this quote unquote caravan sort of materialized below the southern border. It was coming up. Now, we've obviously faced challenges at the southern border now for many years, but somehow the darkest, most dangerous, sort of tales of imminent doom with respect to the border or immigration always gets spun up right before the election. And that is a tactic, it's a strategy to 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 scare people, to divide us. It's been one of the tyrant's favorite tools since antiquity. If you can pit people against each other on the basis of race or religion or national origin, it's easier to pick their pockets of money and power. And so, Trump is a master demagogue, and he knows how to try to divide us. And it's a cynical move, and it's a false move, because in our elections, Americans vote, American citizens vote. That's who votes our elections, and our elections have robust overlapping protections to make sure that only American citizens vote. And there is no evidence suggesting anything otherwise. And so this is a fear-based way of trying to pit us against each other and deprive us of the power to determine our own future. It is a fiction, plain and simple.
It's interesting. When the Brennan Center a number of years back went and actually looked at that, they looked at millions and millions of votes, and they found something like 30 people who were undocumented or shouldn't have been voting immigrants. 30 people out of tens of millions of people. That's about as perfect a record as you're going to get. It also kind of confuses me. Why would someone who's here illegally risk getting detained so they can vote? I mean, gosh, I'm pleased that people are that concerned about democracy, but it doesn't make any sense on its face why people would be doing this. It really does seem to be designed to, frankly, invalidate the results. And you've seen state officials, Republican state officials, claim, oh, there's these lists of people who are undocumented and they're voting. Well, in fact, many of these people turn out to be people who were subsequently naturalized and have every right to vote. But it does seem to be kind of what are their favorite tactics right now. What else do you see is kind of up their sleeves, and what else concerns you? Maybe not so much about the voting result, but what happens when the polls close?
Well, let's start with like a sunnier, brighter piece of news, since
That's good. Yeah,
we've
we're
been
always such Debbie
diving
Downers.
into
Yeah.
some of the murkier parts of the election season. And the place I would start is there is a majority, I would argue a large majority in this country, who believe in a vision of America where neighbors look out for neighbors, where people come together to solve problems, to try to create more opportunity, a brighter future for everybody, where people actually come across divides to get to know people who are different from them, that celebrate our differences as one of the strengths that has made America one of the most exceptional places in the history of the world. That is the dominant ethos in the United States, and that is true also in elections. That majority has dominated pretty much every election since Donald Trump came on the scene in 2016. He's been a disaster for the Republican Party, losing them seats at every level of government, precisely because the majority of Americans are kind, well-meaning, tolerant, accepting, community-minded people who value honesty, who value decency, who want to live in a place where their neighbors look out for their kids and kids can play in the street. And if that's the reality, how, if you are a minoritarian faction, do you prevail against that overwhelming majority? And the answer, as we've seen around the world with demagogues like, Viktor Orban in Hungary, or Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, is you spin up fears and try to divide people. So Bolsonaro was famously misogynistic. Orban, famously warned of sort of hordes of immigrants making Hungary no longer Hungary. Even someone like Narendra Modi has, accumulated power by demonizing Muslims in India. And I would just note, misogyny, demonizing immigrants, demonizing Muslims. Trump has borrowed all three of those things, right? Trump is sort of like the sort of the villains league of pulling all their tactics together and delivered just all of this sort of spewing of hate and division. And that is a tactic that these authoritarians effectively use, because if they can make people afraid, if they can feed on legitimate anxieties that people have about living in a time of rapid change and what the future is going to be like, then they can offer their "I alone can fix it" strongman appeal to say, I know you're anxious about the future, I know you're afraid, I made you afraid, but I alone can fix it. And so that's what these demagogues do, and it's entirely predictable, it's entirely cynical, it's taking place here. And the good news is, for most of the last several elections, the American public have broadly rejected it.
There is a lot of buzz about some jurisdictions where officials will actually refuse to certify the results. There has been a canvassing board, election board in Georgia that has passed all kinds of rules, including one mandating a hand counting of ballots, which is about the least effective, least accurate method for tabulating anything, as anyone who's ever tried to count the pennies in their jar knows from personal experience. What are the pitfalls and what are the backstops? What are the guardrails when it comes to actually counting up the votes and reporting them accurately?
Yeah, I mean, let's start with sort of the baseline here, which is that these county boards do not have the discretion to decide whether or not to certify based on their assessments of whether something in the election is amiss or not. That's just not their job. Think of it this way. In a sporting contest, in a baseball game, for example, these members of the county board, they're the people managing the scoreboard out in left field. Their job is, when a run crosses the plate, they put up the run and say it is now 2-1. They are not the umpires, right? There are other people in the system who are the umpires. There are laws in the system that says, hey, if you want to challenge whether that player leaving from third tagged up or not, you can do that. You can seek a recount. You can challenge in court. There are procedures for doing that where judges and other actors play the role of umpire and go to the videotape and see if the runner was safe or out. There are multiple methods in the system for making sure that our elections are free and are fair and are done with integrity, and that the count is accurate. But the guy who's out there in left field putting up the number 2 on the board, it's not his job. And these county election officials are under pressure to do a job that is not theirs. And the good news is that they really can't ultimately decline to certify. In the midterms in 2022, there were 2 Republican county officials in Cochise County who voted initially not to certify the election. But because that was not their job, and because by doing so they were violating the law, the Attorney General in Arizona indicted them, and they are now facing criminal charges. And moreover, the Secretary of State in Arizona sought court relief to force them to certify, which they did. Earlier this year in Washoe County, Nevada, when initially a county board was declining to certify the results, it was made clear to those members in the media that they would be violating the law and exposing themselves to the same potential criminal penalty as their peers in Arizona. And lo and behold, they brought themselves back into session and they voted to certify, because most people that I've met don't want to be indicted. So the bottom line is, this is not the job of county boards. They are the scorekeepers. They're just supposed to put the score up. And if people have objections to it, there are other methods to lodge those. And if they fail to do that, they're going to get in serious trouble. That's the way the system works. So I think on this front, voters can feel assured that if you go and you cast your ballot, it's going to be counted. It might be a procedural bumpiness for other actors in the system, but at the end of the day, your vote is going to be counted.
Let me go back a few years. Your group, Protect Democracy, came out with a proposal, I believe it was on July 4th of one year, for all sorts of pro-democracy reforms in the executive branch, in the courts, in the Congress. And I, for one, was pretty disappointed that the Biden administration didn't do a lot of the stuff in the executive branch. And it's not at all clear that they needed Congress. I'm talking about things like setting up rules for the emoluments clause. I'm talking about a strict rule in terms of disclosing tax reforms, talking about some real barriers between the White House and the Justice Department. Obviously, they had their plate full with a lot of different stuff. But let's say for a moment, God willing, the Harris administration comes in. What are the sorts of things, for now, let's just talk about the executive branch, that you think should be high on their priority since they have power? And it's not the Democrats who plan on abusing all these things, that they should try to institutionalize now while they have power so that a subsequent Donald Trump, or frankly, a subsequent Democrat who goes off the rails, won't be able to exploit.
Well, I think it's important that we learn lessons from our past experiences and not repeat the same mistakes over and over again. And so, one of the lessons I take from what you just alluded to, the Biden administration perhaps not doing as much as it should have and could have done to strengthen guardrails and kind of, batten down the hatches against a potential future autocrat, is that executives like to maintain the powers that executives have. I worked in the White House counsel's office, and I can tell you that the lawyers in the White House and the Department of Justice always viewed things through the lens of what is most protective and even expansive of executive power. And, we should have realized this dynamic because the founders understood it. They realized that every actor in the system would be fundamentally self-interested in some way, whether that was personally or institutionally. And therefore, they set up this overlapping system of checks so that one institution would check the other. And I think the lesson I take away from the shortcomings of the Biden administration is that it's perhaps misplaced to look at the executive to kind of tie its own hands to the mast in order to not heed the siren song of abusing power. It really is up to the other branches to do it. And so while, yes, there are things that the Biden administration could have and should have done, and there will be things that if there is a Harris administration, it should do, I think the lesson I take away is focus on building up Congress's position as a checking counterbalance. And I think it is, in that respect, it's also important to note that over the last several decades, Congress has really abdicated that role. It hasn't just been that the executive has aggrandized power in the hands of the executive. It's that Congress has basically just stepped aside and let it do that. And in some cases, handed powers over to the executive. And so if we think about where an organization like ours really should focus, in a situation like that, I think the lesson I take away from the last couple of years is focus on getting Congress to do its job, which both is, I think, more likely to be effective because Congress has an interest in asserting its own power and checking the executives. And if they do it, it will be more long-term viable and effective too, because a future executive branch wouldn't be so easily able to roll it back. And I do think that there are signs that we can get there. I think over the last couple of years, Congress has made some steps, not as many as we would like, obviously, but some steps towards doing things. For example, very importantly, Congress has passed some new rules requiring OMB to disclose when funds that Congress has appropriated have been impounded or altered in how they are distributed by the executive branch. This was really important because the first Trump impeachment was all about how a whistleblower had to alert the American public and Congress to the fact that funds that Congress had appropriated for Ukraine, Donald Trump's administration was holding in order to extort President Zelensky into digging up dirt on Trump's potential presidential rival. And the reason it took a whistleblower to do that is because there hadn't been rules in place to force that disclosure affirmatively to the American people. And I think this is underappreciated as one of the powers and frankly, dangers that loom if we were to have a future autocrat in the White House, which is that one of the greatest powers the executive branch has is the distribution of trillions of dollars of funds. And you could see a world in which a future Donald Trump or some other future autocrat withholds those funds from states around the country in order to extort those states into, quote unquote cleaning up voter files and purging them of legitimate voters who might not support that president's reelection. It's an incredibly dangerous and powerful tool that is at the president's disposal. And I think the fact that Congress has actually done something to shed some sunlight on what's happening there is a good reform. There's other movement. There just recently, both the Senate and the House, in bipartisan fashion, moved out of committees in both of those bodies legislation that would put some new checks on presidential emergency powers and return some of those powers over to the over to Congress. So there's movement on some of this. I think there'll be more, and I think that's where we got to invest the next time around, rather than expecting any actor in our political system to sort of voluntarily relinquish powers. That they should do it. We should hold their feet to the fire, but the founders understood that was not the likely path.
One of the features of the last few years that has given me the most, I guess, personal angst, because I'm a lawyer by training, has been the really disintegration of the stature, the integrity, the respect, the approval of the Supreme Court. And maybe these things are linked, or maybe they are separate problems. But there is the ethics basket, where we've seen justices not disclose what they're supposed to disclose, or show evident bias, yet not recuse themselves. There's another basket of things in which you can say the court has sort of ideologically gone off the rails. It's dispensed with years and years of precedent. It uses what we've come to know as the shadow docket to manipulate the cases that it gets, to give either the green light or the red light to lower court decisions without actually having to decide what's going on. And I think the last bucket is the general tenor of the justices, both on the bench in their opinions, but also out in the body politic, in which they seem to be, and some of them seem to be rather bitter about it, political partisan actors. Do you see these things as interrelated? And what do we do about them?
Yeah, I don't want to absolve the court of criticism that it has brought upon itself for so many of the things that you just noted. But I do think that there are external factors that are driving this that we were just talking about, which is Congress's abdication. Because, the founders made Congress the Article I branch in the Constitution. They named them first because the founders really believed that the legislature should be the central locus of decision-making power on behalf of we the people who elect people. That was the most representative branch, although obviously at the founding not sufficiently representative, but it was still more representative than the other two branches. And it was supposed to be the place where we came together as a country to debate our disagreements and resolve them through the legislative process. And I think what has happened in the modern era is that Congress has struggled to do that. For a whole bunch of reasons in which it as a body has become dysfunctional. I think the filibuster is one of them, and unable to resolve society's most contentious disagreements and issues. It has sort of left to the other two branches a vacuum that they have needed to step into. And so the executive has stepped into that vacuum by doing much more policymaking via either executive order or administrative policymaking of the hard decisions that Congress has punted. In some cases, perhaps appropriately, because they're hyper technical, right? I do think there are good reasons in the modern era to have an administrative state that has a degree of expertise in it. And I could see why you might want Congress to punt to, for example, the FDA, some very, very technical rulemaking about procedures for checking the safety of drugs, because there are experts there who are far more expert than some of the members of Congress to do that. So there's an appropriate space for delegation. But I think Congress has gone way beyond that and delegated really hard policy decisions to the executive or the court that really should be made by the people's representatives in Congress. And then, of course, the court then has to fill in that gap and make a lot of very, very hard decisions that Congress has punted. And I think that has made the court even more important as a political base of power. And so you've got, as you noted, people who fundamentally are, kind of partisan actors wanting to be on the court because that's where the action is, right? That's the room where it happens, according to Lin-Manuel Miranda. And you've got a hyper politicized process for confirming Supreme Court justices, and that super politicized process, of course, then polarizes the American public with respect to justices in the court. So the court inevitably becomes, sort of a polarized actor. So the court is responsible for the ethics breaches and the wild deviations it has made from precedent, and frankly, some of the decisions it's made that are just so deviant from the American idea, right? This U.S. v. Trump decision that presidents are above the law. I'm not absolving the court of its horrific behavior on some of those cases that matters, but it also is, I think, behaving that way as a result of some of the failures of the other branches, and we've got to, if we want to fix the problem, I think we got to fix some of those other problems as well.
Now, clearly, the filibuster is one of those problems, but let's say, for sake of argument, you wind up with a Democratic president and Democratic House and Senate, and a Senate that is willing to adjust, modify, carve out some exceptions to the filibuster. By the way, it's a misnomer that the filibuster applies uniformly. It doesn't apply to judges, for example. It doesn't apply to so-called reconciliation bills. So it's already Swiss cheese. The question is just, you want to put a few more holes in the cheese wheel. Let's say all those things are true. What are the sorts of reforms that you would favor for the court? Is it ethics reform? Is it term limits in some fashions? Is it expansion of the court? Where do you think they should go?
Yeah. So look, I think I was a government ethics lawyer. I worked in the White House. I counseled senior level administration officials on their ethical obligations under the Ethics in Government Act and the guidance issued by the Office of Government Ethics. And what members of the court, Clarence Thomas, to name one, have done is such a wildly egregious outlier on how most public servants I know comport themselves with respect to the ethics law. So, for example, when I was in the White House, people would come to me and say, I was out the other day and someone gave me, this mug from the organization with which they work. Can I keep this mug? This $9 mug, right? That's how I remember one of my favorite examples was that a member of the White House staff was a fan of an indie rock band, and the band, learning that they had a fan at a senior level of the White House, sent a care package to the White House for this staff member with all of their vinyl records in it. I mean, the package was probably worth a couple $100, right? But the staff member came to me and said, "Oh my God, this is so cool. I love this. I know I'm probably not allowed to keep it, but it breaks my heart because they're my favorite band. And it's such a memento." And I said, well, you can pay them for it, right? If you pay them fair market value, it's not a free gift. And so they said, really? Oh, and so, they cut a check for whatever, a couple $100 to keep the records. But that's how diligent people were. And the notion that a Supreme Court justice, one of the most powerful people in the country, life tenure, is taking these exorbitant gifts and not only taking them for free, but then hiding it repeatedly is just so unbelievably egregious and arrogant, frankly, and disrespectful of the American people. All that said, I don't fundamentally think that Clarence Thomas is going to vote differently on really any of the cases on which he's voting based on these gifts. I think he would have voted that way largely anyway. It's untoward, it's unseemly, it's unethical, it lowers trust in the court. There's 1,000 things that are wrong with it. But if there were some sort of ethics reform, is that fundamentally going to change the way Clarence Thomas votes? I don't think so. Clarence Thomas is pretty ideological. So for my money, if I had one bite at the apple to do something with respect to reforming the court, I probably would focus on the thing that I think is going to be more impactful, which is term limits. And the thing about term limits that I like is, behind a veil of ignorance, nobody knows whose ideological ox gets gored. And what I mean by that is there are people on the left, like Elizabeth Warren, who have supported term limits. There are people on the right, like Steve Calabresi, the founder of the Federalist Society, who has supported term limits. The fact that people on both sides of the political spectrum see that the founders never imagined that people would live to 100, 105, 110. As we get into the 21st century, lifespans are going to expand, especially among the kind of elite people who get put on the court. And we're going to see situations in which people get nominated to the court at 40, 45, 35 even, and could conceivably serve on the court for 70 years. That's just so beyond what the founders ever expected, given what lifespans were and what the role of the justice was at the time of the founding. And I think people on the left and right realize that putting someone on the court for 60, 70 years is just not consistent with a healthy democracy, nor is it consistent with a healthy system to have people gaming their retirements to make sure that they can only be replaced by someone who is an ideological match for the seat they're leaving. That is anti-democratic in that it denies the American people the ability to potentially elect presidents in a given general direction and see over time in a slightly attenuated way those ideological beliefs translate into nominations to the court. So for all those reasons, I think term limits is a necessary reform that passes the veil of ignorance test, has support on the left and the right, and could be put into place. And I think that would be where I would put my that would be the basket in which I would put my eggs.
Famously, the American system of constitutional law divides power, balances power, protects minority interests. But there is a wide feeling that we have perhaps given too much weight to minority interests. I don't mean racial or religious minorities, but political minorities. You have the Senate, you have the Electoral College, you have the Supreme Court, which is chosen by presidents who may or may not have a majority and approved by a Senate that doesn't represent a majority of the people. You have gerrymandered districts. And all of these things, I'm obviously not the first person to make this observation, is that we have a little bit of a crisis of majoritarianism. Do you see that? And if so, what are the ways we can and should go about perhaps rebalancing our system?
Yeah, I think that there is a crisis, a little bit of kind of minoritarianism, and Francis Fukuyama calls it a vetocracy, that we do have a system that is designed to have a bunch of choke points and checks in order to maintain a degree of stability. And I think it's important for those of us, you and I both, who believe that some reform is needed, to credit the fact that all of those choke points have produced a degree of stability that in many ways is beneficial, right? The fact that the United States has been a consistent constitutional representative democracy for almost 250 years is something. Now, obviously, we've not been a fully inclusive democracy all that time. For a lot of that time, we've been a deeply tragic, flawed, and in some ways, remarkably problematic democracy based on who we've excluded, the period of slavery before we had women's suffrage. But we have had a constitutional republic for 250 years in some form, whereas no other country in the world has been able to pull it off. And I think one of the reasons for that is that in so many other places around the world, the lack of some of those choke points has led to wild swings, where as the winds shift, there are sort of these rapid whiplashes for society that are incredibly destabilizing and would be, especially for a country of 330 plus million people that's as large as ours, if we were to go through that sort of rapid whiplash every couple of years. And so having some choke points for the degree of stability is beneficial, but you could have too many. And I think let's talk for a minute about the filibuster and why I think the filibuster is both a problematic choke point in that vetocracy and one that's really of kind of very recent vintage. And you kind of were alluding to this, Jen. So first off, you and I both, let's just be clear, the way the filibuster has been used in the last 10 to 15 years is wildly ahistorical. For the first 200 plus years of this country, the filibuster was rarely deployed. Most legislation that went through Congress was subject to a majority vote. And only in extreme cases, rarely, was the filibuster invoked. And then sometime in the early aughts, the filibuster became the norm. And it became the situation that any meaningful piece of legislation, had to clear not just a majority threshold, but a supermajority threshold. And so meaningful legislation basically went to Congress to die. And there's two problems with this. One is the one we were alluding to earlier, which is Congress can't solve problems anymore. And so it punts decision-making power to the other two branches. But here's the other problem with it, is that when in a democracy, voters elect a governing majority, say a political party, based on its platform, saying, if you elect us, we're going to, make sure everybody has sardines for lunch. Um, if that party, that governing majority, can't get everyone sardines for lunch, then the voters reasonably should say, hey, you failed at your job and we're going to throw you out. But what if the reason they can't do that is because of a cynical ploy deployed by a minority to block their ability to do that and tell the voters that it was the majority's fault, which is essentially what has been happening, which is that the voters are sending, in some cases, Democratic majorities to Congress. The Republicans are then filibustering everything that the voters elected that majority to do, blaming the failure to pass those things on the governing party, and then winning back power, even though the governing party that was elected the first time tried to do everything it was elected to do. It's a cynical way of deceiving voters. And I think Ezra Klein makes this point very powerfully in his book, Why We're Polarized, which is what you really want in a system is the public should elect a majority on the platform of what that majority claims it will do. Let the majority do that. And if the results of it are positive and the public likes it, reelect those people. And if the results of it are negative, the public doesn't like it, throw the bums out. But that natural sort of cycle for how a democracy is supposed to work is being corrupted and thwarted by the cynical games that are played by minorities by using the filibuster. And I think it's why, if we were to get rid of the filibuster, not only would you have a cleaner way of holding the people you elect accountable for whether they deliver on the things that they wanted to deliver on or not, but there'd be more trust in the system because you'd have less of the cynical gamesmanship.
Fair enough. There are some things that are definitely within the realm of legislation, if we could get past the filibuster, like to have neutral line drawing of congressional districts to make the districts more balanced, have more competitive districts, which theoretically would reduce the number of hyper-partisans in Congress. There are other things that they could do to expand democracy, like make election day a holiday or have some uniform standards for voting and for access to the polls. This was tried during the Biden years and was filibustered. Philosophically, do you think the better approach would be to pinpoint a few things that are the most critical? Or do you think it's a better approach to kind of throw everything at the wall, see what sticks, and run with that? If you were advising a Democratic Congress and a Democratic president strategically, how would you go about fixing as much as you could, understanding you might not only have power for a couple of years?
Well, I mean, one thing I do want to dive in on what you just said is I want to open our minds to reforms that might be beyond some of the more conventional ones that you just alluded to that we've been talking about, specifically when it comes to sort of gerrymandering and line drawing, which I agree with you is one of the most serious problems that we face right now, where people basically are elected by a very, very small percentage of voters in primaries and then are in overwhelmingly safe seats. And the whole idea of accountability kind of goes out the window when people are only accountable to a very small fraction because politicians are picking their voters rather than voters picking their politicians. Here's the thing. In some form, so long as we have single member districts, that is going to remain a problem to some degree, right? Because there's only so many ways you can draw lines. And you're still going to need someone to draw those lines. And take, for example, a state like Massachusetts, which has somewhere between 30 and 40% Republicans in the state, people have tried this. There's no way scientifically to draw lines in Massachusetts to let those 30 or 40% Republicans in Massachusetts get represented in Congress at all. You can't draw a line in which they get to elect a member, even though they're 30 to 40% of the state. And the same is true in reverse in Oklahoma, where you've got 30 to 40% Democrats in Oklahoma, and there's just no way that they're really going to legitimately have some equivalent representation in the Congress, no matter how you draw the lines. And so what I actually think we really need to be moving to is what most advanced democracies around the world have done, which is a system that abandons this whole idea of single member districts first past the post, which is just the worst system for selecting members to a legislature. What a lot of advanced democracies do is they have multi-member districts that are allocated proportionally. And so this has a number of advantages, but one of them is that if you have 30%, 40%, you're a minority in the state, you still get some say. You still get some representation. And I think that not only will that increase sort of trust in the system, not only does it mean that there's less of a any means necessary, us versus them, battle to the death in every election, because if you don't get 51%, you get nothing, right? In this case, actually, if you get 42%, you get something. And so there's no need to actually totally politically, I mean this not in a violent way, kill the other side, because everyone's going to get a little piece of something. And then finally, there's no gerrymandering, because you can't gerrymander there. And so you eliminate the problem of gerrymandering altogether. There's a whole other set of benefits to doing this. We've written a lot about it. You can find it on our website at protectdemocracy.org. But one thing I want to throw into the equation that, this was the question you just asked about, is let's open up our aperture to how we might come up with some reforms that get at some of the root causes of this problem that aren't just fixing sort of the line drawing problem. And I'd like to see us work on some of those as well. And the other benefit to that is you don't have to go through Congress. This can be done, well, at least in part, if you wanted to begin experimenting at the state legislative level, you could do it in states. You could do it through ballot initiatives. If you wanted to ultimately change Congress, you do need to reform something called the Uniform Congressional Districting Act. But I think we would start by using the laboratories of the democracy, the states, to experiment with systems that are now pretty robustly tested and proven around the world.
And I would say these things do change over time. We never thought that ranked choice voting would ever catch on anywhere. And some states have adopted it. It has made a difference. You look at, the House seats, for example, in Alaska, and even the Senate seat in Alaska probably had a different outcome. So these kinds of things are possible.
Yeah, and in the Alaska examples, I think this is true of some of the other reforms I talked about. One of the other benefits is a degree of comedy, right? So if you look at that Alaska House race, the Mary Peltola-Sarah Palin race back in, I forget what year it was, a couple of years ago, both of those candidates were praising each other, right? Do you remember that?
Yes.
They were both complimenting each other, how much they liked each other, what good people each other were, which is something you really don't see that often in American politics. And of course, I think the proponents of ranked choice voting would argue that was the incentive that the structure created, that because they each were trying to be the second choice of their opponent's supporters, it behooved them to be really nice and praise the other candidate. And wouldn't it be nice if in our politics, instead of just trying to tear each other down, we were trying to be a little bit more respectful and nicer to each other? Wouldn't that help with some of our polarization? And so, yeah, I think that, both with respect to ranked choice voting and proportional representation, there are more incentives to say, hey, the other side, they're not so evil. They're not so terrible. And I think you and I both would like to see a politics in which we can actually operate a little bit more as fellow Americans.
So, last question for you. What are you guys focusing on right now at Protect Democracy? What are your big projects before the election, and what are your longer term projects as you look ahead to the state of our democracy?
Well, look, unfortunately, for the past 6 to 8 years, we have been on guard against the threats out there to the integrity of American elections. And I think January 6, 2021 proved that we were right to be on guard to those things. We have a candidate right now, Donald Trump, who's been very open repeatedly about not accepting any result of an election unless he wins, and has a demonstrated track record of trying to overturn the results of an election. And so I think this is a moment where not just we at Protect Democracy, but Americans broadly need to be aware that that risk is out there. And frankly, the greatest antidote to it is to vote in overwhelming numbers and to vote for candidates that are pro-democracy and that understand that you can't just be for democracy when your side wins. So we are working with a broad coalition to make sure that the rules are followed, and that any attempt to corruptly subvert the process is thwarted, as it was in 2020, and I think as it will be again if it is tried. But we also want to be prepared for both eventualities, for the possibility that the former president is returned to power to enact his campaign agenda of revenge and retribution, and to do what he has said is to be a dictator on day one. And so we want to make sure that we are ready to survive that as a nation with a constitutional representative democracy intact. And so we're getting ready for what would be necessary at that moment to make sure that the institutions of our democracy, in a rule of law based way, stand up in the way the founders envisioned as a check on abuses of power, to make sure that the Constitution is honored and survives that, what I think will be probably the gravest challenge it's faced in 150 years. But also, we want to be ready, as you've alluded to here, to the possibility that we have a more pro-democracy president. And how do we take advantage of this moment to turn crisis into opportunity? And the way that I would argue we should think about it is we've essentially experienced three foundings in our nation's history. We had our original founding after the Revolutionary War, the enactment of the Constitution, the creation of the Republic. We had a second founding during Reconstruction after the Civil War, where we finally sort of overcame some of the deep flaws in our original design. And then we had a third founding during the Civil Rights era, where after the Depression, World War II, Jim Crow, we finally, with the passage of the Voting Rights Act, created a really representative democracy in which everybody was able to participate. And each of those foundings was preceded by a period of crisis and deep conflict. And I think we are living through a fourth cycle like that, where we are in a moment of crisis, we are in a moment of conflict, and coming out of it, we have an opportunity for the fourth founding to really finally create the resilient, inclusive, multiracial, multi-ethnic democracy that is written into our founding documents, but we've never actually fully achieved. And I think we need to be ready to do that sooner if we have a pro-democracy president in the White House, but even to do it if it takes some more time, if there's a further sort of autocratic backsliding that happens before we get there. At some point, I think we will get there. And it's our job, yours, mine, all Americans who are part of that, that constituency that we talked about earlier, who really do believe that this is a country in which we should come together, solve our problems peacefully, respect our differences, and strengthen our ability to work together. I think that is a majority, and I think that majority will deliver the fourth founding, hopefully sooner rather than later.
Well, I'll leave you with one thought, and that is next year is the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. And what better occasion would there be to recommit ourselves to our creed of democracy and equality before the law? So hope to see you at all of those celebrations of the Declaration, and hopefully the election will go smoothly. Thank you so much, Ian, for coming back, and we'll look forward to having you again. Thank you for all the work you do in courts, in legislatures, in public education. And you really do live up to your name of genius. See, I knew I was going to get that in there, our MacArthur genius guest. So thanks once again. We'll see you next time.